Hello, I'm Yale Gotsdiner. I was born in Omaha, Nebraska on July 16th, 1922. And that was almost a farewell time for me to Omaha because my folks lived in Council Bluffs at the time. We lived above the store in those days, and we had a small bungalow type of arrangement with two small bedrooms and a kitchen and one bathroom. And my mother took that little area and she made it like a little dollhouse because she was very good at that. And I grew up in Council Bluffs, and as time went on, my dad, who ran a grocery store at the time, was doing very well. And this was before the Depression. And we ended up by building a home. That is, my dad decided that we ought to have a home. So at 2643 Avenue D in Council Bluffs, he bought a lot. And that lot in those days was $600. And that was a nice location in the western section of Council Bluffs. It was a new area. But the problem arose immediately that the $600 was returned to him because he could not have a lot there. There was a gentleman's agreement. So, of course, there's nothing he could do about it except that he explained to his friend named Gronstall, Mr. B.A. Gronstall, who was then president of the Council Bluffs Savings Bank. He told him the story. And Mr. Gronstall said, "Joe, if you want that lot, you can have it." And my dad said, "Well, we want it." He said, "Even though your neighbors don't want you, you want it?" "Yes, I want that lot." So Gronstall says, "You will have it." The next day, he bought the lot for $600, called my dad, and said, "Joe, bring down the $601 to the bank, and it'll be your lot." And my dad said, "601? He said, "Yes." He said, "I have to show the bank a profit." So there was a $1 profit for the bank. And those were the days when people knew each other and did things like that. So he he had the home built, and it was a nice bungalow, and very nice. And then my grandmother came to live with us. My grandparents had immigrated previously from Russia, and they came up through Galveston, Texas. And they came to Omaha quite by accident. They were going to go to New York where they had relatives. But lo and behold, they ran out of money in Omaha, and so that's how they settled there. They ended up in Omaha, Nebraska. And my dad also tells a time when his family came up through Galveston, and they landed in Omaha, and they went out to buy furniture for a little hovel, a little tiny house they bought was a little shack. I'm sorry, they did not buy it. They were going to rent it. They went out to a used furniture place to buy furniture with the help of somebody from Hyas. A representative Hyas was going to help them. So they ended up by buying a bed and a mattress and and a stove and some kitchen utensils and all. Well, it was delivered to them by horse and wagon. And when they set it up, and my grandmother lit the stove, and lo and behold, the fire, it was coming out of all directions. There were cracks all over the stove, and it was a fire hazard. Then they set up the bed, and there were all kinds of insects coming out of the mattress. So they said, "This won't do. We're going to have to take this back." So they got a hold of a fellow with a wagon who was willing to hitch up his horse, load up the stuff, and take it back to the used furniture dealer. When they got back, they wanted a refund on what they had paid because they didn't have any money to speak of. They wanted a refund, and the owner of the store told them, he said, "Welcome to America. Let the buyer beware." And he said, "No, you don't get a refund." So that was the end of that. So they had a very, very difficult and trying time in those days. They lived on Franklin Street, and I'm not sure of the exact address. And my mother's parents lived on Charles Street. And that was a Jewish neighborhood at the time, and I can still recall visiting my grandparents and going down to Adler's Delicatessen. Well, it wasn't a delicatessen at that time. It was sort of a kosher foods place, and then Adler's had a bakery, and it was kind of exciting for me to go there in those days. And I can still remember my grandmother haggling the price with Mr. Schukert at the Jewish kosher meat market. And incidentally, Mr. Schukert, it was Mr. Mushkin. Mr. Mushkin was the grandfather of the gentleman, Stuart Muskin, who later became my partner in business. So that was that story. In the meantime, I was growing up in Council Bluffs, and I went to school at Avenue B School, at grade school, and I can remember the fist fights we used to have with the Catholic kids who were going to school at Holy Family School. Then, as time went on, I went to high school at Thomas Jefferson High School in Council Bluffs, and everything went well. And my main activity there was I was a partner of Bob Passer on the debate team, and we eventually won the state tournament at Iowa City, he and I, which was quite a feather in the cap of Thomas Jefferson High School, because in comparison, it was relatively small. And then when I graduated from high school, I came down to, went down to Lincoln and to the University of Nebraska. And Bob Passer, my former debate partner, also came down to the University of Nebraska, and we became debate partners here. And we, together with 4 other people who made up the debate squad, we won the Missouri Valley tournament. At those days, it was called the Missouri Valley League. And time went on, and I finally got to my junior year at the university, and the war broke out, World War II. And I was in advanced ROTC at the time, and so we were put on alert, and we were taking out of our fraternity houses. I was a ZBT. We were taking out of the fraternity house, and we were billeted in what is now Love Memorial Library. At that time, it was a new building, and there were no volumes in there whatsoever, just soldiers. We were activated. We used to march to and from the Student Union building for meals. We got up in the morning to sound of reveille, and at night we had taps, and we were given so much study time. Our lives were pretty well regulated at that time, and we bemoaned the fact, as I remember, that this military life was really tough. We didn't know what was in store from some of our people later. So anyway, that time came that I wanted to graduate before I went into the service, and so I met with the dean of the college, Dean Oldfather of the Liberal Arts College, then called the Arts and Science College. And I told him I wanted to graduate, and I had to carry 23 credit hours in order to do so. And he said, no. He said, you can't do that. It's too much. And I said, well, please, give me a chance. Give me a shot at it. And so he said, okay. He said, I'll let you try. But he said, if you get a downslip, that meant failure at the end of a 6 weeks period. He said, you have to drop the courses and bring it back to 16 or 17 credit hours. And that was the agreement. Well, by the skin of my teeth, I managed to get through those 23 hours. I had to take science courses to complete the requirements, so I was taking physics and chemistry, I remember, at the same time. And the labs at the school, you have to remember, at that time, the University of Nebraska was a school of about 6,000 students. So the labs conflicted. They occurred at the same time, so I couldn't go to both labs at the same time. So I had to dry lab chemistry, because I couldn't do that with physics, and that's not a good way to learn chemistry, by the way. And so I didn't really learn a lot of chemistry. So at any rate, I managed to get through the courses, and I remember my diploma was mailed to me at Camp Roberts, California, out on the desert on maneuvers, and it really didn't seem very relevant at that point. So anyway, but everything was fine. I was very fortunate. I did not get hurt in the war, actually, not from combat anyway. And at Fort Benning, Georgia, where I went to after basic training at Camp Roberts, we were shipped to Fort Benning, Georgia for OCS. And at Fort Benning, I later became an instructor. And one of my jobs, I taught 2 or 3 different things. And one of the things I was teaching was swimming, what they called combat swimming at that time. And I was teaching it to field grade officers, that is major and above, and also female personnel. So we had WACs in our class too. Another fellow and I were teaching them, and I can still remember that. That was considered choice duty with the WACs there, and we enjoyed it tremendously. And anyway, I did that, and I never got overseas. I was stationed at Fort Benning for the duration of the war, and then I was shipped to Camp Blanding, I should say, Camp Blanding, Florida, where I was discharged, and came home. I came home, and I had worked in my dad's grocery store somewhat in high school and so forth, and I frankly did not like the grocery business. And I told my dad I did not want to go in the grocery business. And by that time, he had been quite successful. The store in Council Bluffs, he had a store in North Omaha, he had a store on North Broadway in Council Bluffs, and he had a store on Madison Avenue in Council Bluffs. So he had 4 stores going, and I never could understand how he could control the inventory because that was before the age of computers. It was all done by hand. And I was involved in some of that when I first got back. One day, Stuart Muskin drove by my dad's store, and he stopped to see me. And he said he had an idea of going into the children's business. And Babytown. That's how Babytown came about. And he and I went into that business, and we were partners for a total of 40 years. And Stuart was a marvelous partner, wonderful person. We had 40 years, and he and I never had a quarrel during that period. And that's kind of unique among business partnerships. It doesn't mean we didn't disagree. It meant we never quarreled about anything. We settled everything. And he and I eventually had a store at the Crossroads Shopping Center in Omaha. And we had a store at the South Roads in South Omaha, or near Bellevue. And we had another store at the Crossroads. And then we opened a store also in Lincoln at Gateway. And that brought me to Lincoln. And I came down here to help get that store started, and I managed to drive back and forth constantly, and that was it. And eventually I moved here because driving back and forth almost daily got to be quite a chore. In the meanwhile, I had gotten married to Irene Witt of Columbus, Georgia, and her family eventually moved to Atlanta, and we had 4 children. 2 boys and 2 girls. Karen was the eldest of the bunch, and then there was Gary and Steve, and then Lynn, the youngest. And we lived in Omaha at 512 Ridgewood Road, near West Side High School, near Loveland School. And all went well. The children grew up, and I always felt fortunate that our business yielded enough in revenue that I was able to educate the 4 children. The eldest daughter became an attorney, and she practices now. She's married, and she practices now in Minneapolis, and she's very successful. And telephone. And can you shut it off? Karen has. She has 2 children, and one just graduated this past year from Tufts University near Boston, and the youngest one just graduated from high school. Both of them have been very, very good students. The youngest one has been a good athlete as well. He's been a baseball and basketball player and he's done extremely well, being captain of both teams at his high school. And he's going to go to school now, to the university at St. Louis. That's at Washington University. And so all is going well. Karen's husband is a physician. He's a neurologist and doing very well. And Gary is the next child, and he practices law in Omaha. He's done well. Unfortunately, he lost his wife recently. The third child is Stephen, and Stephen is a CPA in Denver, getting along fine. And the fourth child is Lynn, who is a rehab counselor, and they live in Omaha. Her husband is a psychiatrist, Jerry, and they have a son also. And his name is Michael, and Michael's a junior at Westside High at the present time. So everybody is getting along well in the family. We have no complaints. Our biggest tragedy was the loss of our daughter-in-law at the age of 49, Judy. She was a very, very extraordinary girl, a wonderful person, and very bright. And she was a lawyer. She practices law with Mutual of Omaha, where she was a first vice president there. She rose through the ranks at Mutual. So generally speaking, life has been good to us, and we're very grateful for that. And now I am retired and enjoying my retirement. I speak sometimes to groups on the subjects of anti-Semitism, the state of Israel, and that keeps me somewhat busy. I usually have 2 or 3 a month that I talk to high schools and sometimes a teacher's college at the university and classes at the community college here. And I really enjoy that. And I particularly enjoy the questions that students ask because I think I learn more from them than they do from me on the basis of the questions that are asked. And I'm surprised how knowledgeable kids are nowadays. We have a tendency to demean some of the youngsters. And it's not like it used to be, of course. But it's amazing how bright some of them are. They're so knowledgeable. A lot of them are on the computer a great deal of the time, and they pick up so much information. It's a world of information. And beside that, my hobby is model railroading. I build a model railroad, and I like to play with the trains. And so that's also a hobby. I like to read, and my wife's, Irene, is an avid reader as well. And I might say she's an excellent cook. And that's to my chagrin because I have a weight problem. And so I think I've covered most of the relevant things in my life. Everything else as well. I have a cousin I might mention in Kansas City and one in Des Moines that we see frequently. And Irene goes down to Georgia very often to see members of her family. So I think life has been good, and I have no complaints. And I hope that someday somebody will look at this and maybe get a smile or two out of it.
Yale, I'd like to ask some questions. I'd
Sure.
like to ask about your father, about his family.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell me something about that?
Yeah, his father, my dad had 12 brothers and sisters, and out of 2 marriages, his mother passed away early in his life, and then his father remarried and came here. And the family kind of drifted apart. There were so many of them. Some stayed in Russia. A couple of them went to California, and 1 or 2 of them ended up in New York. And the family kind of drifted apart. But he was very, very close to a brother in Wichita, Kansas, Leon Gotsdiner, who later moved to Omaha and worked with my dad a little bit. And he was very close also, that is, my dad was very close with John Gotsdiner in Des Moines. And all 3 of them were grocers. so they had that relationship. That was not unusual in those days for immigrants to go into the grocery business. My dad said he had a choice of going in the grocery business or the furniture business, and he decided on the grocery business because people, quote, always have to eat. So that was that. Times were very, very difficult in those days, and the two other brothers just kind of eked out a living. And but they managed to put their children through college too. John in Des Moines had one son, Harold, who is still very close to me, and he went through Drake University. And Stan, now in Kansas City, son of Leon, was a World War II ace. He flew 34 missions over enemy Germany as a fighter pilot. Fortunately, he came back okay, and he was somewhat of a hero, and I shouldn't even say somewhat, I think he was a real hero. And he's a very fine fella. He was a journalism major at Kansas, went to work, incidentally, for Hallmark in Kansas City after doing a stint as a small-town editor of a weekly newspaper. And he got tired of that and moved to Kansas City and took a job with Hallmark greeting cards, where he was an editor of greeting cards. And he told me that nothing became so sickening as to reading greeting cards. Got pretty tired of that. And then he was hired by I've forgotten which one now, but an investment firm, a large national investment firm, and he rose to the position of vice president of that firm before he retired. So he was quite successful too. And that just about takes care of that. Irene has a substantially large family in Georgia. They're real Southerners, and I met most of them during the war when I was stationed at Fort Benning, and Irene's family was living in Columbus, Georgia at the time. And so I used to take a bus into Columbus, and that was only a matter of about 25 or 30-minute ride. An interesting event happened on the bus one time. I got on this bus. It's called the Howard Bus Line that transported soldiers back and forth. It was a civilian line. And I got on the bus, and later, driving down the street, you have to remember now, this was in 1942, and things were different in Georgia. And a black man, a black soldier, got on the bus, and the driver told him that he had to move to the rear. And the soldier refused to do that. He sat in about the second row of the bus. And the driver told him, if you don't move to the back, this bus isn't going to move. And the soldier got up and went to him. He said, you don't know what the hell I'm fighting for. And he says, if you don't move this bus, I might have to send you through that windshield. And the driver picked up on that, and he drove into Columbus, Georgia, and the soldier never moved. And when we got into Columbus, the driver turned to the soldier and says, I'm going to call the MPs on you. And the driver says, again, remember what I told you about that front windshield? And so that was the end of that. And we all got off the bus, and that situation ended. But it was so typical there, because I remember in Columbus, Georgia, when we would walk down the street, that is, white soldiers would walk down the street, the black folks would get off the street, off the sidewalk, I mean. And it was kind of unnerving. And there were white and black water fountains, white and black restrooms in the city. Everything was segregated, and would go into a restaurant, there'd be no blacks in the restaurant. So those were difficult times, I think, and they were hard for some of us who were Jewish, I think. We've known ourselves what prejudice can amount to, and so it was very painful to see other people suffering that way too. And they were degraded, and in the army in those days, most black soldiers drew the most miserable duty. They were quartermaster attached, and they did some of them were on permanent KP, some were on permanent latrine duty, all cleaning up all sorts of messes. And so that was not a very pleasant thing. And later that was changed, thank goodness. And black soldiers, when they were in combat, accounted for themselves generally very, very well. The Tuskegee Airmen, which you may have heard of, who flew many, many missions from a black squadron. They were escort pilots, fighter pilots, escorting bombers, and the great thing, they never lost a bomber during their entire history. And several of them gave their lives to save those bombers. And also there were some blacks that ended up in a black tank outfit, combat tanks, and they accounted very well for themselves. So it's a great argument against the idea of inferior people.
I want to hear a little bit about how you met Irene.
How I met Irene? Well, when I was stationed at Fort Benning, a lonely soldier at Fort Benning, Georgia, there was a fellow, Paul Raymar, I remember, and he told Jerry Bernstein, another soldier who was then stationed at Fort Benning, about a girl he was dating named Irene Witt. And Paul was going to be shipped out too. He was going to be shipped overseas, and he knew that I was not on the shipping orders yet, so he contacted me and told me that there was a young lady in Columbus, Georgia that's home from school. She was going to Sophie Newcomb College in New Orleans, and that was a college for white young ladies at the time in New Orleans. So I wrote her, and she wrote me back, and we struck up a little correspondence. And when she came home for the summer that year, I called her, and we had our first date. And I can still remember, in those days, the young ladies wore a hat, and sometimes gloves, white gloves in the South. And but I remember I took her to dinner, and I called a taxi. I took her to dinner, and on the way back, I started to put my arm around her, and she took out her hat pin, and she showed me how deep it would go. So I took my arm back. But later I married Irene, and so we lived happily ever after.
When did you get married?
We got married in 1946. I came back, and I wanted to get established before we got married. And so we had nearly a year engagement and separation, where she was still in Georgia and I was here trying to get established. And I did get established. That's when I went into business with Stuart Muskin, and then we were married later.
I'd like to hear now about your mother's side of the family.
Okay. My mother, her side of the family was, her mother was Pearl Harmel, Harmel, and her dad was Solomon Harmel. And they settled in Omaha, and my grandfather, that is my mother's father, was a student of the Torah. He spent most of his time studying. They had virtually nothing, but he did his studying. That was paramount, of course. So he did that, and to try to make a living, he grew flowers and made his own perfume, because in Russia he had been what they called a chemist. Actually, we would call it a pharmacist, but they mixed their own compounds in those days. There was nobody supplying the ingredients, the completed compound to them. They took the ingredients and made the compounds. So I still remember his mortar and pestle sitting on a counter at home. But anyway, they tried to eke out a living that way, and it was a struggle. And my folks and my mother's half-brother helped to support them. And I remember very well that they passed away, and my grandfather from cancer, and later my mother and my grandmother simply died of age. she had lived with us for a while, and she was wonderful. But I'll tell you a very interesting little story. I came home from grade school one time in Council Bluffs when my grandmother was living with us, and I was all excited. I was excited because who's coming to school tomorrow but Santa Claus, and he was going to bring gifts to everybody. And I was just thrilled and delighted with Santa Claus coming. And I told that to my grandmother. Well, my grandmother didn't come from the Santa Claus background at all. And she told me, Zets, and meant sit. Okay, and she said it very authoritatively. And I sat, and she said, let me tell you about Santa Claus. This was all in Yiddish, which I can't repeat, unfortunately. But she said in Yiddish to me, Santa Claus is a ganef, that meant a thief. Santa Claus is a chazer, which is a pig. And Santa Claus is a ligner, which is a liar. And that was the end of the whole Santa Claus business. I never mentioned Santa Claus again at home. That was the end of that. So, but anyway, she was a wonderful old lady. She did a lot of cooking at our house because my mother would help in the store a good deal of the time. And she did the cooking, and I can still remember her making wine for Passover in the basement of our home. She did all that. She's a marvelous baker, and her challahs were wonderful. And she was really a fine old lady. She really was. And she was virtually illiterate. She had practically no schooling at all, of course, in Russia. She came here, and there was not much of an opportunity here for her in those days. But I still remember her with a lot of fondness. And I still have a breadboard that she used to knead the challah on. So I have fond memories of she and my grandfather, who was, I say, the scholar, but when I would come to Omaha sometime to spend the night with him as a little kid, he would take me by the hand, and we would walk to Kresge's, 5 and 10 store, and he would let me buy a toy. And the toy was probably anywhere from 10 to 20 cents. But that wasn't easy for him because the 10 to 20 cents came very, very hard. But he was very, very sweet and very, very kind. So I have good memories of them.
Can you remember back when you'd have a family dinner on an occasion, Shabbos or one of the holidays?
Yeah, we would drive to Omaha sometimes from Council Bluffs to have Shabbat dinner with my grandparents. And it was a real Shabbat dinner. It was a special occasion. It was always chicken, and my grandmother's bread. It's just absolutely wonderful. Challah, I still remember, and I can still almost taste it. And in addition to that, there would be the potatoes and either asparagus or green beans with it. And then we had the daven, and we had to have a little lesson on Torah. That my grandfather would give us a lesson, and we had to do it. And I'd better not get up while he's giving that lesson, because that was holy. I had to listen to it from beginning to end, no question. And an interesting thing was when we had our seders at their house. That was particularly interesting, because here I was, a kid at this time, at about 4 or 5 years old, and it became my duty to learn the Fir Kashas in 3 languages. I had to learn the Fir Kashas in Hebrew, of course, read it in Hebrew, and then I had to learn it in Yiddish, and then which I did in my fractured Yiddish, and then I translated it into English. And my grandfather would sit there and nod when I was doing okay, and then he would give me a look when I made a mistake, and I could still remember that. And those seders, they would start probably around 7 o'clock, 6:30 or 7 o'clock, and usually lasted somewhere approaching midnight. And that was hard for a kid in those days to sit. And I look at my grandchildren today, and sometimes they have a hard time just coming to the Seder because it's a ball game or something that conflicts with the Seder. And it's a real sacrifice to come to a 2-hour or hour and a half Seder. So anyway, but things are different. That's all right. And but they're all progressing well, so I have no complaint.
Yeah, what was a typical day like when you were in high school?
When I was in high school, well, we didn't have the mods and all the things that the kids have today. We had sessions that were, as I remember, were 50 minutes long, and we had, about 6 subjects, I think, something like that. And we went to school at 8:30, and I think we got out at 3:30, as I recall, something like that. And we took such subjects as the usual subjects: the history, the geography, the math, the English, those kinds of, they call it today course subjects. We didn't know from course subjects. They were just subjects, and we took them. And then we had 1 or 2 electives. I remember I took one in speech and one in drama, and those were just electives. And we had a honor society at school, which is a privilege to be admitted to the honor society. The faculty had to vote on you. 3/4 of the faculty had to agree, and the majority of the students at the school to get into the honor society. And that was a big deal. So that's what I can remember. I remember going out athletically for track. So I was running a dash, and the coach told me that I had very good form. He complimented me. He said, "Yale, if you could just do it a little faster." So anyway, but I didn't have a very good track career. It wasn't much of a career. I wasn't much of a track man.
Were you involved in Jewish activities as far as the AZAs?
Yeah, we had AZA 7 in Council Bluffs, and I was a member of that. And I learned some things, and I learned to play blackjack. I learned to shoot craps. But other than that, in AZA 7, I didn't learn a lot. But I remember going to a couple of conventions, one in Sioux City. That was a lot of fun and enjoyable. And I met some very nice fellows up in Sioux City. Some of them became friends of mine most of my life. But AZA didn't do a lot for me at the time. And I was also a member of Troop 2 Boy Scouts. And I got to be an Eagle Scout, and that meant more to me. I don't know why, but it just happened to me. It appealed to me. That's all. So that was my high school career. I told you debate was a big thing to me in high school. I was very interested in that.
Did any friends carry over with you from Boy Scouts?
Yeah, I've got a couple of friends that I still correspond with on email, and one of them is in Tuscaloosa, and another one is just outside of L.A., and we still correspond back and forth, and occasionally have seen one another at a high school reunion.
How about the AZA boys?
AZA, well, I still remained friendly with most of them, Jewish fellows, and so I remained friendly with them. But now they're scattered too, and I have very little contact with that group now. I have a lot of contact with my fraternity brothers from Omaha. They're in Omaha. They were ZBTs at the university. We still get together every 3 or 4 weeks for breakfast. And so I have a lot of contact with them.
Who are some of them? ZBT brothers?
Well, let's see. There was Norman Rips, and there was Smirren, and of course Stuart Muskin, and Eddie Malashok, Dr. Malashok, Harold Bernstein. Those were I think, yes, and Kiwi Kirschenbaum, Joe Kirschenbaum when he's in town. I think those were most of the ones I still remain very close to. Mm-hmm.
Tell me something about your life in Lincoln today, Yale.
Life in Lincoln today? Well, Lincoln, like many of the smaller communities, is not growing. Unfortunately, the Jewish community is either stagnant or shrinking somewhat. The problem, as I see it in Lincoln, is that Lincoln does not attract technological industries or advanced scientific industries of any kind, and it doesn't bring a lot of bright Jewish young men to town with their families. And most of the youngsters that grow up in Lincoln, leave and go to larger cities for their opportunities. We do have 2 or 3 younger doctors that have moved into Lincoln, which is good. We have Tifereth Israel Synagogue, and we have the temple here, B'nai Jeshurun Temple, and both of them are pretty close in membership now, about 120 families in each one now. And but it's a financial struggle for both of them, and the Jewish activity doesn't compare with that with Omaha. But we do have regular Friday night services, and there is a Saturday morning service at the synagogue, and a Friday night service at the temple. And we do still manage to have that. And at the synagogue, I think we have a pretty good school for the youngsters yet. Still be able to maintain that. So, and that's good.
Has the size of the Lincoln Jewish community declined over the years?
Yeah. When we came here 32 years ago, it was much larger, and there's been a real decline in it. And unfortunately, there's been a decline in interest on the part of the younger people. They're not as interested as the younger people were when we first moved here.
I know there's a part of your life that you haven't mentioned yet, Yale, and that's the luncheons that you used to have here in Lincoln. And I don't know whether you still do or not, but I'd like to hear you tell me about it.
Well, every Wednesday we have a kindergarten luncheon. That's what we call them. They're all kindergartens. The youngest one's about 78 years old. And we meet at the Knolls every Wednesday. And what I do is get on the phone, and I call all the fellows. There's about 14 that I call that are interested. I call to get information as to whether they'll be there that Wednesday. Then I call the Knoll restaurant, and they set up for that number. And so when we get there, the table's all set and organized. We will average anywhere from 10 to 12 or 13 each Wednesday. And these fellows are pretty loyal to it. One rabbi we had some time ago suggested that we could turn that into a study session. And I said, Rabbi, you're going to kill it. Right then and there. The thing that makes it work is there are no officers, there are no dues, there's no program. They just sit around and schmooze. They have lunch and schmooze, and they all get a kick out of it, and we have lots of laughs. So I think that's what perpetuates it. And I guess the justification for it, if there is any at all, is the fact it's a group of Jewish fellows that get together and have a good time. And we do it every single week. Now, the ladies are getting together too, but they only meet once a month, and Marcia Kushner is in charge of that group, and she gets that group together, and they have a pretty good turnout too, that's at least equal to ours, but they just do it once a month.
I also heard that you were the prime mover, that when someone didn't have a ride, you took care of that.
That's right. Well, some fellas are not able to drive anymore, so I try to pick them up or make arrangements at least for a ride, so they get to the lunch. And it's been good because I've heard a lot of stories from old-timers in that group. Emmanuel Winch now, I used to pick him up, and Abe Novikov, I used to pick him up, and let's see, who else? Oh, yes, Harry, I can't think of the last name at this moment, but I used to pick him up. And so I had, at one time, I had 3 of them in my car, and they would talk about the olden days. And so I learned about the generation previous to my own, and that was fascinating. Right.
Well, I think we've pretty much covered your life, Yale. I mean, we can't do that in an hour or so, but I think we did a pretty good outline.
Well, I hope so. I hope so.
But it's been a delight for me to be here and to listen to this because it's been very interesting.
Well, good, Ben. I'm glad you came. I think it's wonderful you do all this. You're the prime mover of this program. And as a matter of fact, you may be the only mover of it, but you do a great job of it, Ben, and it's a privilege to be considered. Thank you.
Thank you.